Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining me on the Frontline again. Today, we're going to be talking with Lisa Darragh. She's a lecturer in mathematics education at the University of Auckland, has a PhD in mathematics education, and she has been quite active writing articles about the state of maths education in the country and some of the changes that have been proposed to curriculum nationwide. We're also going to go a bit further afield and talk about the impact of poverty and sort of social issues on how our kids learn, and a little bit about the funding of the educational system and some of the changes recently made around that. So I think this will be a good conversation, and thank you for joining me this week. Remember to follow my Substack articles if you want a little bit more in-depth conversations about things like this. Without further ado, let's pop you on here. Lisa, hello. Thank you for joining me.
Good. Thanks for having me on.
Did I get your introduction right? You're basically a researcher in mathematics education. Used to be a teacher, but you now study how kids learn mathematics and how we can do it better.
Yeah, well, I'm a researcher in mathematics education. My interests are more in the socio-political aspects of mathematics education. So looking at those wider issues and how they might impact on the learning and teaching of mathematics in various societies. And then the other half of my time is educating primary and secondary school teachers to be teachers.
Oh, cool. All right. And years ago, you were a teacher yourself, right?
That's right. Yes. Mostly at the year 8 level was where I was teaching.
Nice. All right. So let's pop this up on the screen, and we'll have a little bit of a chat about the new maths curriculum. One of the things I jotted down reading these articles was that this is the third curriculum for teachers to have to adapt to and remodel their teaching around in 3 years. 3 curriculums in 3 years just doesn't sound doable to me. And I read that more measured countries, let's say someplace like Singapore or European countries, would have introduced this over a 1 to 2 year basis, and they might only make a huge curriculum change every decade or so. So what's going on here? Why the sudden need to ramrod through such big changes?
Yeah, that's a good question. It kind of it feels to us like the curriculum's kind of been used as a political football. You know, it's been used to sort of score points with the voters to say, "Hey, look, we're fixing things, we're making stuff happen. Here's a new curriculum. Everything's going to be magically wonderful." But the curriculum isn't kind of a magic. It's not like waving a magic wand. It's just one thing that might help to improve the way education is going in the country. And it certainly needs time. Like if you create it, to create a curriculum takes time. To create a good curriculum takes time. It takes time for teachers to learn what's in that curriculum. And then it takes time for whatever changes that have been made to actually have an impact. And so to have a third one written in 3 years, it doesn't make any sense at all.
And teachers are expected to adopt this curriculum, or can they use their discretion and take the elements of it that they think are good and leave the bad behind? Or is it a wholesale swap and change from what they've been teaching?
Well, the curriculum document itself, when it becomes mandated for use, it's a legal document and teachers have to teach from the curriculum. So the difficulty for teachers has been they were given a new curriculum to start using at the beginning of this year, and it was a whole year ahead of when they expected it. So that second new curriculum that was written, normally you'd expect teachers to have about a year where they've got it, but they don't have to start using it yet. But the government decided to say, no, you need to start using it immediately. We're making it law from the beginning of this year. So teachers did start using it immediately. There was a whole lot of professional development, couple of teacher-only days where the children had to stay at home or the teachers learnt about the new curriculum. And they've been trying to implement it into their practice this year. And that everyone thought it was the new curriculum, it was the final curriculum. We wouldn't expect there to be another one for a good number of years. And then just very quietly and casually, this new curriculum kind of just slid on in and became the new law to be used for next year.
This makes no sense to me because it's a waste of a lot of money. You're talking about having to train teachers up only to swap and change it over essentially a few months later. Obviously, the outcomes are going to be bad from this because if you've had, again, 3 curriculum changes, I could just imagine how disconcerting that would be. Um, what possible reason was it? Do you think it was literally so that they could look like they're doing something, that they're taking aggressive and active steps to change things? Is that the theory behind this? I mean,
It's
obviously you
really
can't speak
difficult.
for them.
Yeah, it's really difficult to know what the reason for this latest new curriculum is because there hasn't been any kind of proper announcement. There's been no reason given for changing it. Some of us suspect that maybe the reason has something to do with the assessment, the new assessment regime that's also meant to come in next year. So we know that that was outsourced to a private provider, not a New Zealand company, and teachers have been waiting to receive this new assessment tool that they're meant to be able to assess students against the new curriculum with. And it still hasn't arrived, but our suspicion is maybe rather than making an assessment tool that's matching the curriculum that teachers are using, maybe they have instead changed the curriculum in order to match the assessment tool, which is not the way it should be done.
Yeah, I think I remember seeing some pictures recently of a foreign man being propped up by 2 national politicians. I think Erica Stanford was one of them, and he was an advocate of going back to sort of old school education and bringing back traditional values. I mean, it's sort of that whole rhetoric of traditional Western values in teaching maths, and I think he is a big proponent of sort of an international movement to do that. That is really admired by neoliberal governments. They
Mm,
want that return uh, to tradition. Interesting. I wonder what
mm,
they will do when it doesn't go well because they've essentially set themselves up for failure with it. This isn't how you roll out any change management program. And it makes me wonder if this is another example of what in healthcare I have referred to as defund, destabilize, and privatize. You essentially you underfund something on purpose, you allow infrastructure to wane, and it gets so bad. It's almost the NHS model of healthcare. It gets so bad and so underfunded for so long. In the UK's case, it was 14 years. In us, it's been less than that, where the only alternative for regular folks seems to be, oh, well, we got to go privatize now. So
mm,
what we're seeing in healthcare is uh, money's being put out in the private sector, and it's pulling public doctors and public anesthetists, endoscopists, nurses out into the private sector, and it's sort of doubling the understaffing in the public sector because it's the same doctors doing, that can either work at the public hospital or the private one, but not really simultaneously at both. And so we've got a real push in healthcare to just privatize everything and say, well, private teleradiology needs to take over our radiology departments. Private urgent cares need to take over our public sector ones, and on and on and on, right down to primary care. I wonder if something similar is happening. I guess maybe they don't want the public sector to thrive because if you create chaos, it's a bit of an impetus to say, hey, look, the only alternative to this broken educational system is to go with the charter schools, the private schools, the for profit
mm.
schools.
Yeah, I was wondering if you'd bring up the charter schools. It's It's interesting because there hasn't been an enormous uptake in the charter schools since they were introduced at the beginning, reintroduced by Seymour. And there hasn't seemed like there's this sort of joint mission between Seymour and Stanford with the charter schools and what's going on in the public system. And unless you wonder, as you're saying, if you make the public system bad enough, more schools will opt into the charter schools. And what I find interesting is that there's this very strong push to standardize everything in the public school sector, and that standardization is kind of a bringing it down from best practice to a kind of a low level type of educational practice that's not innovative and doesn't serve local community needs or the particular interests of the students in that school, which is exactly what charter schools promise. So you sort of, on one hand, you're creating a public educational system that's worsened, if you like, and then on the other hand, you offer up the private system of the charter schools. So you could be bang on there with your analogy.
Well, there's quite a few hypocritical things that David Seymour's doing with the whole charter school deal. They are free of the same type of curriculum requirements that the public schools would be under. So a public school needs to slavishly follow Erica Stanford's curriculum, but a charter school, for some magical reason, is trusted and given the authority to develop their own curriculum, as long as there's the sort of end result is somewhat similar at the end of it all.
Yeah, the other
The
hypocritical thing is the charter schools are funded to be able to have as many teacher aides as they need. And that's the one
Yeah,
thing that teachers without fail cry out for, is more teacher aides in their classroom. Is that, anytime more money is flashed about, they say, well, why don't we have more teacher aides with that money? And that's what the charter schools get.
there was a great article I read where David Seymour was holding up and praising a Christchurch school, a charter school, for its fantastic performance. And of course, it was no surprise. They, for every classroom of 25 children, they had a teacher and up to 3 teachers' aides. So of course, you're going to do well if you have adequate staffing. Meanwhile, we just had a community conference in town, you call it a lecture, where teachers' aides stood up. It was the night before the strike. They were talking about how their professional development funds, so the small amount of money that they would get to go to a class or a course and learn how to be better, how to maybe deal with kids with learning disabilities more effectively, even that has been stripped away from them. And I mean, it's almost like we're intentionally developing 2 different New Zealands here, one of the haves and one of the have-nots. Yeah, so that, I don't know what
Absolutely.
to call that other than hypocrisy.
Yeah, and I mean, you could improve teacher aid situation in the tiniest way by, at the moment, they're kind of funded for almost sort of 9 o'clock till whenever, sometimes till 3 o'clock, sometimes 1 o'clock. But all you would need is even an extra half hour or an hour where they're paid to come in and chat to the teacher and just talk about, what are the learning goals, how can I help you, what would you like me to do today, and have that kind of conversation with the teacher would make an enormous difference. But they're not funded for that extra hour, and so that opportunity is lost.
I was reading, and I mean, the more I learn about what's going on in the public sector, the more my mind is blown. But it was something along the lines of a principal saying that the money to hire teachers' aides comes out of essentially a different pot of money than the money to hire staff, such as teachers. And so you essentially, he has to choose between spending like an operational budget to improve the school, or losing some of that money to employ more teachers' aides. And it just seemed so incredibly backward that he's having to pit running his school against staffing it properly.
Mm. And that would be a school probably not in a high socioeconomic area that, and probably can't rely on having a wee fundraising day and earning thousands of dollars from the local community, because, that, and it's another way that we ingrain inequities in our society.
Yeah. It's incredible. In that same article, they talked about, and again, things like this, I think, would blow the mind of a regular person that's not in this field, that the money that's allocated towards the schools, let's say a principal gets X amount of dollars, let's say $100, they have to pay GST out of that funding. So the $100 becomes $85 immediately because they're literally having to pay GST on it. And then they are forced to pay for the Holiday Pays Act stuff up. So a mistake was done in interpreting the Holidays Act of, I think, 2003 or something. And that back holiday pay that was miscalculated and is owed, like, appropriately to the workers, that was a stuff up done at the sort of highest levels of payroll and things. And yet the person feeling it is this person in an underserviced, disadvantaged school with not enough staff and not enough money. They're watching another 8% disappear from their budget. So now that $100 is even less. It boggles the mind that this is the backward way in which we fund schools in the country.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't know much about the GST rules involved in school funding, but I do know that we underfund our educational system, and we're often compared to countries like Singapore, and why don't we do so well as Singapore? Let's follow their curriculum, but we we don't look at the bigger system, and we don't look at how more money is being pushed into education in Singapore, and more money is put into professional development for teachers in Singapore, and so it's apples and oranges. You can't compare us to a country like that.
Listening to the teachers' aides and teachers talk at this community talk, they talked about the high incidence of behavioral disturbances and learning disabilities, and all of that sort of thing. There was a study, the survey, I guess, of year fives that said 63% of students in year five arrived to school tired, 43% hungry, and 16% nervous. They found that the kids that had the most bullying also had the lowest maths achievement. They found that of year fives, 8% of kids had embarrassing pictures shared on a monthly basis, which had doubled since 2018. 1 in 5 were getting bullied once a week. 2 in 5, additionally, were getting bullied once a month. And teachers talked about high levels of disorderly conduct affecting their ability to teach and their kids' ability to learn. So how can you not have an obvious understanding that what's needed are teachers' aides rather than one teacher addressing a classroom of 30 kids alone? That just seems, again, we're setting people up to have a disastrous outcome.
Mm.
And yet that's not what I hear emphasized. Like, this isn't the stuff that's making the headlines. And you're not hearing big announcements of doubling the amount of teachers' aides in classrooms. You're hearing, if anything, the opposite. Like, schools are actually losing some of their teacher aid funding for the reasons we talked about. 4,000 teachers are being affected by the defunding of resource teachers, in not just in Modi, but also in literacy services. I don't understand this. Do you have insight into this or commentary on it?
Well, I mean, there's there is a limited educational fund, right? And it's too limited. I mean, the better, well, in my own opinion, you raise taxes and you fund education properly along with other essential services. But when you've got a limited fund, if you want to look like you're making change and doing something, you have to steal from another area. You have to take money away from something like resource teachers of literacy and resource teachers of Māori literacy and behaviour, and then use it to pay overseas companies for their textbooks and give those textbooks to every classroom, instead of listening to what the teachers really want, and that's people in their classroom supporting them. Yeah.
That almost seems like it'll be the last thing that ever gets done. It seems so far down on the priority list of things that government politicians will do. Actually hiring nurses to staff our EDs, actually hiring teachers' aides to staff our classrooms, that almost seems like the one thing that they will not do. They're willing to try almost anything short of that, but not that one thing. It's quite fascinating.
Especially at a time like we're in at the moment, when there's quite high unemployment and people are desperate for jobs. These are teacher aiding is the ideal job for someone who's caring for children. They can be a teacher aide, but they can also be home in time for their children to come home from school. It's a really fantastic job for a parent to get back into the workforce after caring for young children at home. It seems like it would be a win-win situation to fund more teacher aides, along with nurses, of course, as well. Yeah.
But instead, we have women's pay equity getting struck down, which will harm all of these very groups we're talking about. We've got anti-smoking laws being struck down, and 300 million being given to the tobacco companies to help them sell more heated tobacco products. So it's almost backwards to how you would run any socially progressive government. It's almost as if this is intentional. It reminds me of something interesting in the past 2 months ago. They'd been saying there was no money for, let's say, teachers, no money for nurses. But under urgency, Judith Collins located $9 billion new money to fund a doubling of the military budget. And so I've been somewhat involved with the whole aspect of New Zealand Defence Forces essentially struggling to be compensated, struggling for housing, struggling for just to be treated as equal workers. And it's been a very rough time the past 5 years, I'd say, for the Defence Forces and for anyone in them. And yet the announcement was not that the 9 billion in new funding or 12 billion overall was going to make these defense forces workers' lives better. They weren't going to fix any of the housing issues and all of the horrible challenges they face. It was going to go to buy a single helicopter for $400 million, right? And it wasn't a single one. That's just the per piece cost. I think it was 5 of them that were purchased. So it's going for international weapons systems from the US and from Europe. It's not actually going to people. We talk about he tangata, it is people, it is people. That is just lip service. It is not people. It's about funding corporations, it would seem. It's about privatizing our schools.
And it's not even funding New Zealand corporations, it's funding international corporations. It's not even buying things that were built in our own country. And that's what we're seeing in education as well. The money is all going offshore instead of spending the money on the people, as you say, who live here. Yeah.
That's incredible. That's incredible. I don't know where another year of this is going to end us up, or perhaps another 4 years of this. It's quite concerning to me. Can I put up a screen now and you just give me some comments on no, not that. Let's try to, I think this was it. Why, it's an article and stuff, why New Zealand's math results are slipping and have been for 20 years. New Zealand students recorded their worst ever results in OECD program for international student assessment, the PISA exams, with average student dropping up to 15 points in maths. What is your comment on this? Were we world class and now we're mediocre, or is something else going on here?
Well, I mean, the main thing that's going on is that we're slipping in the ranking rather than slipping in our actual achievements. So our own internal assessments in the country show that we're kind of tracking the same. So we've got the same level of achievement, the same level of learning is going on, but we're dropping in the rankings, and so it's not good news. Why would we drop in the rankings? Is the question. And I think the answer is because teachers have not had any proper systematic professional development in mathematics for 20 years. It was about just over 20 years ago that we last had what was called the Numeracy Development Project. And it was this enormous project into how children learn mathematics. And it was rolled out across the whole country, and teachers learned and got extra resources in their classrooms and sort of a new pedagogy for teaching mathematics. It wasn't without its problems. There've actually been some unintentional consequences of that project. There's been a whole lot more ability grouping, within class ability grouping in primary school as a result of the way that project was enacted. It wasn't really intended by the people who developed the project, but it sort of became a way that teachers taught their classes. So the two things one is the absence of professional learning over these past 20 years, and there's only so much you can learn at university before you start teaching. You actually have to learn on the job and learn continuously over time. That's why in Singapore, just to throw Singapore out there again, they have 100 hours of professional learning every year as just part of the everyday teaching.
100
And
hours of professional learning. How many hours do New Zealand teachers have of professional learning? 100?
in mathematics, they might not have any. It depends on what goals the schools have set for their own sort of staff professional development. In some cases, it's about a teacher's individual professional development plan. And because our primary schools, you're not specialist teachers, it may easily be in another subject area. So we definitely have been short on professional learning. And the second thing is this practice of ability grouping became really widespread. And what happens when you ability group is you give differentiated curriculum to the different groups. And so those students who were labeled top ability, they kind of got taught at or above the expected level. Maybe the second group got taught at the expected level, but then the bottom group didn't actually get taught material at their age level, and so the gap would widen and widen each year. And so you had children entering intermediate school and then secondary school at a really wide range of opportunities to learn particular maths content. So the two things, I mean, there's no silver bullet to fix educational problems such as slipping in the international tests. But two things that would go a long way would be really great professional learning and enabling teachers to teach in ways other than ability grouping. And the first of the new curriculum really kind of covered that off. The first curriculum was all about you must, these are the levels of expectation at each year level. You must teach students who are in year 4, you must teach them year 4 material. You must give them the opportunity to learn that material. And so that was sort of aiming to address that issue. But
Was that from the national government, the first of those three, or was that a Labor curriculum, or neither?
It began under the Labor government. The process began with the Labor government asking the Royal Society to put together a team of experts to look into the curriculum. So it was initiated by Labor, but it wasn't kind of strongly political. They kind of gave the responsibility to an apolitical group who could then assign a team to look into it. And then after that curriculum review, they started writing the curriculum. There was a very diverse group of experts who were writing it. But that curriculum was the one that it never got a chance to be taught. It was replaced once national came in.
Got it. Got it. Can we talk about streaming for a minute? What are your thoughts on gifted and talented kids? You know, kids identified early on and then sort of hot-housed and told they're smart and given smaller classrooms and good teachers and sometimes with much less concerns about behavioral issues within those smaller classes. And then unsurprisingly, they tend to do really well. So what is the international research? What does it say about streaming kids? And obviously the flip side of that, marking a child as slow, unable to keep up, and then dumbing down their classes, warehousing them through school for whatever may come in their future, whether it's low employment, unemployment, or prison. What does the literature tell us about that?
Yeah, the vast majority of the literature finds negative consequences for streaming, and you've kind of already outlined a whole lot of the reasons for that. There, even in the so sometimes students in the top stream classes do better, and they are for the reasons that you're talking about. They do get given small classes with troublesome children taken out of them. They get given the most experienced teachers, and they tend to do well, but not always. Some of them don't respond well to that hot housing and that accelerated pace through the curriculum, and it actually get put off maths. Particularly, the research shows that girls in the top stream classes can find that. So in general, the literature supports de-streaming, and there are groups working really hard to de-stream secondary schools in mathematics. It's something that's popular with parents. Often schools say, well, all the parents always think that their child will be in the top stream, and so they like the
Right.
idea of streaming because they kind of see a potential benefit for their child. But the evidence, the evidence suggests that we would be better as a nation to not stream, but teachers also need support. So if you're a school that's always streamed and then you de-stream, you do need to give teachers support in how to actually cope with the wide range of previous attainment in the classrooms. And so it's something that has to also be fixed at the primary school level, by the not having ability grouping at primary school level, so that you kind of lessen that enormous range that you get and sort of bring up those bottom achieving students up to where they should and could be achieving. But the other research, more local research, shows is that all the students who are already marginalised in our society are further marginalised by streaming practices. They get disproportionately placed in those lower so-called ability groups.
Sure. And I mean, in my own personal observation, it's more than a coincidence that those are often the poorest and most marginalized kids to begin with, the ones that have to deal with problems at home. Again, the ones that are part of that 43% coming to school hungry, 63% coming to school tired. How, I'm going to ask you the impossible question. When you have a country with significant wealth inequality and great inequities and unevenness, how can a mere teacher or a mere school compensate for all the problems that the kids bring in from home, whether it's violence or abuse or just a stressful environment? Do you think teachers can make up for problems of poverty and neglect? Is it possible?
Well, the amazing thing is sometimes teachers do, sometimes schools do. Sometimes schools are a safe haven for students. Sometimes teachers end up being that one person in a student's life who who has faith in them and high expectations of them, and provides kind of an environment where they can learn. Teachers and schools do amazing things, but they're less able to do those amazing things if they're burnt out by constant change and reform and constant underfunding of the system. So I mean, the best bet is to try to create conditions where teachers and schools can do the best job that they can.
One of the best ways I've seen that dealt with in healthcare is the introduction of nurse to patient ratios. So there are some jurisdictions in other countries that have instigated strict limits, like you will not fall below, one nurse to 5 patients in this setting, or 1 to 2 in that setting. And I mean, I'm a big believer in that, because I think if you don't do that, you end up with the situation we have now, which is people constantly being pushed to do more and more with less and less. Is there any research that you're aware of about teacher's aid or teacher ratios to students, or classroom size, or financial resourcing, or anything like that?
This is one that I don't know of research that supports it. Anecdotal evidence says that all teachers always say that class size makes a difference, but it's quite difficult to prove that, because there's always so many other complicating factors. So as soon as you have
Right.
the big class sizes, there are other things going on. So the research sort of shows that it's other things that impact on the quality of the learning experience rather than class size. But every single teacher will say class size matters.
And I think it's interesting that if you go to your average expensive private school, the very first thing you will be told about, other than the great facilities and the great quality of teachers, is the tiny class sizes. I mean, that's sort of every parent's dream, is that they will be nurtured through school by a great teacher in a small class where their child can pursue their gifts and their interests. And yet somehow that all falls apart when it comes to talking about the public sector. Um, yeah, it's fascinating. What are classroom sizes nowadays?
They they tend to be different depending on the year level, and so I don't have I don't have the numbers at my fingertips. Um, they're often 1 to 30 in the public school system, but I would have yeah, I'm not 100% sure.
Yeah, same. That was sort of the numbers that you'd hear about in public schools in my kids' era. They're a bit older now in uni. Um, do you have Can you opine for us on social media and phones in schools? I don't know if that's an area of your research expertise, but you'd certainly know more about it than I would. What are your thoughts on smartphone bans and things of that nature?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think it's a nice kind of, I don't know, a vote getter to just say we're taking action, we're banning cell phones. But I do, yeah, and sometimes you want students, and say in a mathematics classroom, you want them to have access to a device, and if they don't have a laptop to do, a smartphone might do it instead. But then on the other hand, I also see the damage that social media can do, and so I do think there is some sense in banning cell phones. I think it is something that schools are quite capable of achieving themselves. Schools can create cell phone policies and enforce those cell phone policies. I don't see it as requiring kind of a government intervention. But there are certainly I'm actually, rather than speaking from a maths research perspective, I'm speaking from a parent perspective now, and I see how easy it is for children to get addicted to the reels, how easy it is for there to be harm, for the social media to cause harm and mental, mental health issues. But this is not my research expertise. This is sort of speaking as a parent.
Likewise, and I would second that as an emergency doctor of seeing kids whose social lives are dominated by their online life and by the abuse or the accolades they get in their social media, and the distress that causes. And I think it's quite interesting that some of the very wealthiest tech bros who have fortunes in the hundreds of, well, I was going to say hundreds of millions, but in the several billions, they sometimes will try to get their kids into schools that are completely smartphone free, sometimes even digital free, period, for years, until they're old enough to handle it. And they don't see any problem with that. They see all the harms and not many of benefits. So they carve a different path for their children.
Yeah, well,
While
I mean, that's because they know how they've designed
right,
these applications, right? And so the area that I do know a bit more about is the use of applications for the learning of mathematics. And I've done research into platforms like Mathletics and Education Perfect and Matific. There's a whole range of them that are used in schools, and they're designed to be addictive. They're meant to, and these are the learning applications rather than social media ones, but they're designed for they have these invisible algorithms that assess children at every moment while they're using them and feed information to the teacher, but they're also feeding information to the company. And so I find it amazing that we are letting these private corporations into our public education system. They make money off of our children, and then at the same time they use the data that our children are creating as they're using these in order to be able to make a product that's more profitable. And I don't think we think enough about that whole process.
Yeah, well said. Well said. Tell me about PISA scores. What they do, what they show. I have some numbers here that between 2018 and 2022, our math PISA scores dropped, but mainly among the poorer and most disadvantaged students. So, how does that testing work, and why do you think that would be the case?
Well, what I know is that one of the reasons that it's more the reason that our score isn't getting any better is because we as a nation have a growing gap between the rich and the poor, and we have and correspondingly we have a growing gap between the high and the low achieving. And there's always a close correlation. When you've got an unequal society, you have unequal achievement. So there is an interplay between issues of wealth and issues of achievement in schools that often get ignored when people are looking at ways to improve education outcome.
So then it may actually be not so surprising that we would have plateaued or stagnated if at the same time, we're growing wealth inequality, wages are stagnant, and conditions are bad for a lot of workers, and unemployment is rife, and so there's just, I know that in our region in Northland, there's just epidemic, legendarily high levels of kids who are unemployed, but also not in training and also not in education. And yeah, it's obvious to me that if you allow poverty to grow, education rides off the coattails of that. And yeah, you can't really fix one without fixing the other.
Absolutely.
That leads us into a much bigger conversation than just education, though. Maybe at that point we'll end it here. And I would ask you to if there's any hope for the future, if we wanted to, let's say you could advise any government on how to do things in an evidence-based way. What are like the top 2 or 3 things that you would point to and say, this is what you have to do if you want to head this ship of education in the right direction? What are those?
Well, if I could choose anything at all, I would want there to be more money given to education. And then that money has to be spent cleverly. It needs to be spent locally. And probably the number one thing to do is to put teacher aides into classrooms, but also make sure that those teacher aides and the teachers get the professional learning that they need to be able to make a difference in that classroom.
The irony is we're doing the opposite of that. We're going to essentially eliminate some teachers' aides and eliminate the professional development funding that they would have had. So that doesn't bode well. When you say more education, do you have any rough idea of how much New Zealand spends on its education compared to like other OECD nations or anything like that?
I know that data is available, but I don't have it at my fingertips, so I
No,
I'm
fair
not
enough.
sure. Mm.
Fair enough. I've got one last thing to share with you. This was an article from the press, and it talked about, you talked about a second ago, more money for education. In a way, this is what more money for education looks like. It's is giving
Mm.
charter school pupils $50,000 each in public funding, when the same public school kids would be getting around 10,000. So I guess this is what more money in education looks like, but it's only going to benefit these 15 new charter schools and 30 converted state schools, which I guess is the problem. Five
It's
times the average per student spend. Wow.
yeah, it's a huge problem, and it's very obvious that it's employed in order to make charter schools successful. You know, moving the money into the school system is a way of defunding the public system. But in the longer term, you can only assume that that money will also disappear out of the charter school systems and be replaced by uh, other funders, business funders, perhaps, or for-profit schooling, as it has happened in other countries.
Well, I guess as is happening in this one with Crimson Education. So these
Exactly.
big international corporations, these private equity companies will want their pound of flesh. They need to keep profits pouring in. And so yeah, at some point they'll squeeze a little bit tighter. Mm. All right. Well, that's another depressing episode for the Frontline. Thank you, Lisa Darragh, Dr. Darragh, for joining me. Um, really educational, no pun intended. I think there's going to be a lot of things that teachers and parents and others would be interested in learning about from this one. So hopefully it gets shared around. And maybe we'll have you on again after an interval to see how these things are bedding in, to see what's happening. Do you have any idea about any upcoming data releases or numbers or things that will be changing in the lives of teachers over the next year or two?
The enormous change that is happening will be the assessment systems that come into play. And from what I understand, the ministry will be providing um, this new smart assessment tool, and schools will also have the opportunity to pay for the PAT assessment tool, which they can pay for now. And from what I gather is that if they opt into the smart assessment tool, then that data is owned by the ministry rather than being owned by the school. So there, it,
Hmm.
it's an important choice for schools to make. One is sort of free, but then they lose control over their own data. And what we've seen internationally is this sort of data can be used to publish league tables, to kind of argue that schools are not performing without kind of considering who the students are in the schools. And so there's a lot to play out in that space that we are worried about.
All right. So we'll have you on again and we'll talk about that when it happens. Thanks, Lisa, for your time. I appreciate it. And Yeah, good luck to all the teachers and teachers' aides out there. We're behind them, as you are.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming on the front
Thank
line.
you for having me.
See ya.